In today's tutorial, you're going to be learning how to create these particular sci-fi wavy strands with particles moving in 3D motion randomly, yet perfectly looping. You'll learn so many techniques on creating loops in various methods, and I think watching this tutorial, although a bit longer, will definitely be worth it. Timestamps will be given in the description, so you can skip to whichever section you feel will be most relevant to you. And until then, let's begin the tutorial. In our default scene, we'll bring our cursor to the junction of these two windows, click and drag to create a new window as we do in most Geometry Node tutorials, and then change the editor type from the 3D viewport to the Geometry Node editor. Then we can press this plus to add in a new Geometry Node tree, and we can zoom in and select the group input and press X to delete the default cube. Now we can press Shift A and search for a cube and plug this into the geometry of the group output. Now the reason why we use this particular cube and not just the default cube is because we can play around with the size and press Shift, click and drag down so that you select all three of them and make the size something much larger. So we'll go with maybe 5 units on each of the axes. Now that we have this cube, we want to distribute a bunch of points within the cube. So we can press Shift A and search for a mesh to volume node to plug that in right there. And just to help speed things up, we can decrease the voxel amount a bit. If you want to see exactly how much time the entire process is taking, you can go to the drop down over here and just switch on timings as well. So it takes 84 milliseconds for it to calculate the mesh to volume at a voxel count of 64. If we bring it down to 32, it just becomes 24 milliseconds. So I think that is going to be worth it. Now I'm going to distribute points within this volume. So press Shift A and search for a distribute points in volume node and plug that in here. Now we have a bunch of points. Now these points are currently just points, but we want them to be spheres that can be seen when we render this out. So we have to instance spheres onto each of the points. So we can search for an instance on points node and plug that in right here. And for the instance, we can search for an icosphere and plug the mesh into the instance. Now we can increase the subdivisions to something like 6 or 5 and just press Shift A and search for a set shade smooth node and plug that in right there. Now clearly the icospheres are way too large, so we'll decrease the radius to maybe 0.1 and we might change that a bit later. Now we have all of our points distributed within the volume and we want these to actually move around and perfectly loop. To do that, we can actually use a set position node and actually add in some noise to the position. So we press Shift A and search for a set position node and plug that in right here. And we have to play around with the offset. So we press Shift A and search for a noise texture. And if we plug the color into the offset, you can see everything shifts a bit to the top right. And that's because when we add in random noise, it averages out to 0.5 on each of the axes. So we have to subtract that to bring it back. So we press Shift A and search for a vector math node. Remember, we have to use vector math for all of these and the color output of the noise texture, not the factor, because this is in 3-dimensional space. So we plug that in here and we change this from add to subtract and we change this second value to 0.5. So now it comes back to the center. Next, to actually get this to move around, you can see we have the noise texture set to 3D and we can change it to 4D. Now playing around with the W gets it to wiggle. So that's what we're going to be doing. But if you want this to move even more than what we can move with W, as you can see the jiggling motion is very minimal, which I think is absolutely perfect for what I'm doing. But in case you need something a little stronger, you can select the subtract node, press Shift D and change it from subtract to multiply and plug that in over here. Now change the second vector to larger numbers if you want more motion. So if we make it to something like 5, you can see the W value gets them to move around much more or in much larger paths. But that also shifts this up by the 5 units. So we have to multiply this 0.5 by 5 as well. So it would become 0.5 into 5, which is 2.5 to bring it back to the center. In order to make this such that a single value for the multiply node will take care of this subtract node as well, you can simply press Shift A and search for another math node, change it from add to divide. And because these values will always be the same on all three of the axes, you can actually use a single math node and not a vector math node, but you could use a vector math node as well. Wouldn't make too much of a difference. However, now we'll press Shift A and search for a value node and plug this into the vector and have the same value go into this divide node and just divide it by 2 and plug this into this vector of the subtract. So once you do this, you can increase the value to like 5 or whatever number you want, and you will always have it in the center no matter how much you increase the value over here. So if you play with the W now, you can see you have huge amount of motion because I've multiplied it by a lot. For now, I'll just keep it at 2 and that should be all right. Next up, we need to actually loop this noise texture's W value. So you can increase the timeline over here and change the end frame to the final frame that you want. That's going to be 150 for me. While I'm at it, I'll set all of the animation defaults. So I'll go to the output properties, change the frame rate to 30 frames per second. End frame is already 150 and the output wherever I want it to be saved with a file format of FFmpeg video and an encoding container changed to MPEG-4 with an output quality of perceptually lossless. Now on frame 1, I'm going to select this noise texture, press Shift D to duplicate it, and I'll press Shift A and search for a mix node, and I'll change this mix value from float to color and just plug that in after the color of the first noise texture. Then I can plug the second noise texture's color into this B socket of the mix node. On frame 1, I'm going to keep this value at 0 for the first noise texture, and for the second noise texture, I'm going to change the W value to maybe 0.5, and I'm going to keep this factor of the mix node all the way to 0. Now you could hover over these and press I to add keyframes, but if you do add keyframes, if you were to duplicate this to use the same set later on, you'd have to keyframe the values again, and I don't want to do that. So I just want 2 nodes which I can connect to the duplicated versions of this noise texture and mix nodes later on as well. So I'll press Shift A and search for a value node and just press Shift D so that I have 3, and then plug them into the W sockets and the factor of the mix node respectively so that I can reuse these later on. So now on frame 0, I'm going to keep this value at 0, hover over it and tap I. This value I'm going to keep at minus 0.5, hover over it and tap I. And this value on 0 itself, hover over it and press I. Now go to frame 150. I'm going to change this to the negative value of this. So this is minus 5. So this has to be plus 5 or minus 0.5 and plus 0.5. This one is now going to go to 0 and this one is going to go to value of 1, and hover over each of them and tap I. Then make sure that you select all 3 of them by shift selecting them and then coming down here and pressing T linear, and that way you will get a smooth loop where these particles keep moving around randomly, and when it comes to the actual end of the animation, they perfectly loop back to the beginning. So that's perfectly all right, and these 3 nodes I will use a bit later, so I'll just shift them back out here. Next up, along with these circles, I want some strands to be present which are also fairly wavy. To do that, I'm going to just shift the group output to the side and press Shift A and search for a join geometry node so that I can have both the circles as well as the strands. Now let's start creating the strands. To create the strands, first I want a plane on which I'll instance some lines. So press Shift A and search for a grid node, and I can directly connect the grid node to the join geometry. Remember, if you have Node Wrangler switched on, you can press Alt, right click, and just drag from one node to the other and it'll automatically get joined in. Now the grid node has appeared, but I want it to be the size of these spheres. So I'm going to have to increase the size on the X and Y to 5 meters so that it becomes the size of these spheres. Next, I need a bunch of points to be distributed on this grid. So press Shift A and search for a distribute points on faces node, place that in right here. And I'm going to change from random to Poisson disk so that I can increase the distance min to reduce the number of points that are actually selected. So I'll make the distance min to something like 0.75. Now on each of these points, I need to instance some sort of a line or a curve. So you could use a mesh line or a curve line. I'll use a mesh line for now, but before that I have to search for an instance on points node so that I can actually instance the mesh line. So now press Shift A and search for a mesh line node and plug this mesh into the instance. Now we have a bunch of lines going straight up. Now the thing is that they go right up because we have it set to an offset of 1 unit for every single one of the counts. But I don't want that. I want it to be of a fixed length that goes from this bottom to the top. So I'm going to change it from offset to endpoints, and I'm going to have the start location at the bottom. So I'm going to have a minus z value of 2.5 would bring it to the absolute base of the cube. But because I'm going to rotate it, I want it to be a little lower than that. So I'll keep it at minus 3, and the end value I'm going to keep at a positive value of 3. Now I have all of these lines, but I want them to be really smooth when we actually add in the noise to it. I'm going to increase this count to a really high number, maybe 500, so that it's nice and smooth. Next up, we need these to actually curve around. But if you search for a set position node and try to mix them around with a noise texture by pressing Shift A and searching for a noise texture, you'll see that the entire thing moves and not the individual points. So to get the individual points to move, you actually have to realize the instances. But before we do that, we'll go ahead and do everything that would be required before we realize the instances or before we actually curve them. So right now they're just lines, but we want them to have some sort of thickness so that they can be seen. So we can press Shift A and search for a mesh to curve node and plug that in here, and then convert it back to a mesh with a curve to mesh node and plug that after the mesh to curve. Now for the profile curve, we can search for a curved circle and just plug that into the profile curve. Now clearly it's way too thick, so we're going to reduce the radius to something like 0.1 units, and that should be all right for now. Next, we want it to be nice and rotated, so I'm going to rotate it on the y-axis by maybe 35 degrees just so that they're tilted. After that, I want just a few of these to actually have a different material, but if you realize the instances, you cannot select a few of these instances. Instead, you can select different points, and selecting instances becomes really hard. So I'm going to actually select just a few of them by pressing Shift A and searching for a separate geometry and plugging that in right after this curve to mesh and changing it from point to instance so that a few instances will be selected when we select something using this selection socket. So we can press Shift A and search for a random value node and change it from float to boolean so that it's either selected or not selected, and plug that into the selection. Now you can see we get a few of them selected, and we can reduce the number that's selected by reducing the probability or increase the number by increasing the probability. Now since I just want a few selected, I'm going to reduce the probability really low, so maybe a probability of 0.095 is all right. And you can always play around with the seed to get a different selection if you want. So I think this selection has ones that are there at the bottom and ones that are at the top, but the number that's selected is actually much larger. So I'm going to go ahead and continue playing around with the seed till I get a distribution that I like. So I'm going ahead with a seed value of 15 and a probability of 0.095. And this is what's going to have the lit material, and all of the others will have the normal base material. So for that, you have a selection and an inverted node. We're just going to have to join both of them together. So for now, we'll use the inverted socket in the set position and use the selection in a while. For now, we need to play around with the offset using these same nodes that we created over here. And that's why I created these separately so that we don't have to redo all of the animations. So we can just select these nodes along with all of these nodes in case you want them, and then just press Shift D to duplicate them and move them up here. Now I'm actually going to just take these and shift these up to about there, and then select all of them and move them down to help organize them. Now I can go ahead and plug this vector into the offset value of the set position, but again, it's not going to work because we haven't realized instances. So we can press Shift A and search for the realize instance node and plug that in right here. Now you can see how the noise is affecting each point individually. So the first thing that we have to do is actually reduce this scale by decreasing the value. Instead of 2, we'll make it 0.5, and that'll reduce the strength of the noise. Second thing, we can change the scales over here, and I'll just reduce the scale from 5 to maybe 0.4 on both the noise textures. Remember that the value has to be changed on both of them, and they have to be the exact same. Only then will it loop. For that as well, you could use a separate value node, but I think that won't be too much of an issue. Now connect each of these into their sockets respectively. So the first one goes to the first one, the second one goes to the bottom one. They're all going into the W sockets, and the last one goes into the factor of the mixed shader. So once you have that set, even this noise for these strands should be looping when you actually play the animation. Now each frame is going to take 1.8 seconds to actually load, so you'll have to manually switch to different frames to see the motion and make sure that the motion is actually happening. If you feel like the motion is too subtle, you can go ahead and increase the scale values over here and just play around with it till you get a motion that you like, or keep the scale value down and play around with this value as well to increase the actual distance. So I'll keep the scale values at 0.4 itself, and I'll increase this value to maybe 2 again. So you can play around with these. And now we can actually do the exact same thing for the selection, which is going to be the ones with the light material. So we just select these, move them down, press Shift D to create a duplicate, and now plug this selection into the geometry and this output from the vector into the offset value. And now you can connect this up to the join geometry again. Alt right click and just bring it in there, and now it's connected. Now we have to set the materials for each of these. So first thing that we have to do is go to the material properties over here and add in 2 new slots because we need 3 materials in total. The first material is going to be for the spheres. The second material, we can press new and change the name to strands. And for the third material, we can add in a new material and call it lights. Once we have these, we can press Shift A and search for a set material node, plug that in here. Now this strand is the one with the very few strands which I want to be the lights, so I'll switch this over to lights. Then I'll take this set material, press Shift D and bring it down to this strand, and this is for all of the other strands. So I'm going to call this strands. And finally, I'm going to press Shift D again with that selected and bring it down to this particular branch, plug it in, and then change it from strands to spheres because these are for the spheres. Now, of course, the node tree gets really large, so it's best to actually select these and frame them accordingly. So this is where we create our strands till the separate geometry. So we can select them, press Ctrl J, which will add in a new frame, then go to the node tab over here. If it's not available, press N to hide and bring it back. Change the label to strand creator. Then we can select these 5 nodes on top, which is the random value node, the separate geometry, the realize instance, set position, and set material. Bring them up, press Ctrl J and change the label to lit strands. Now this entire section was created to help create the wavy motion. So just select all of the nodes or press B to box select them, press Ctrl J again to add in a new frame and label this as wavy looping motion. And by labeling these out nicely like this, anybody else who's using it apart from you will also be able to understand the flow much better. These nodes were used to create the spheres. So Ctrl J, sphere creator. In case you do download this from Patreon, you'll be able to understand these nodes much better and play around with it yourself in a much easier manner. So now these nodes were used to create the motion of the spheres. So Ctrl J, sphere motion, and that should be it. Now we can start off with the actual texturing. To do that, we'll set all of our render defaults. So we'll go to our render properties, switch on bloom, and we'll expand it and clamp it down at something like 4. And we'll also switch on screen space reflections. Then we'll switch the geometry node editor from the geometry node editor to the shader editor. And we'll switch our viewport display to rendered, after which we'll select our camera, press Alt G to clear location, Alt R to clear rotation, then rotate it on the x-axis by 90 degrees, grab it on the y-axis to the back, and then press 0 to actually go into the camera view. Now you can grab it on the Y to just place it in wheresoever you feel makes the most sense. So I'll place it somewhere like this and actually select the material and start texturing. So we'll go to our material properties. First, we'll play around with the spheres. Now we haven't realized instances for the spheres, so that's why if you actually press Shift A and search for an object info node, you can actually see that the random value actually selects each sphere separately and gives it a random color. So that can be used to get a certain number of these spheres to actually light up. So to get them to light up, we're going to have another shader, which is going to be the emission shader. So press Shift A and search for an emission shader. And to mix the principled and the emission, we can press Shift A and search for a mix shader and just plug this shader into the surface of the material output. Now the principled BSDF is going to go into the top shader and the emission is going to go into the bottom shader. And for the factor, we're going to use the random value of this object info, but we have to pass it through a greater than node. So we can search for a math node, switch it from add to greater than, and then plug the random value in there and plug this value into the factor. Now, if you see, a random number of them are lit, but I want much fewer of these spheres to be lit. So you can play around with the threshold. In my case, increasing the threshold is going to reduce the number that's getting the emission node. So I'm going to keep the threshold at 0.85 and I'm going to go down to the emission, change the color to a nice blue and increase the strength really high, make it something like 20 or even higher. Let's go with 200. Remember, because it's clamped, the blue won't go too far and instead it's going to start becoming whiter, which just makes it look really bright. Along with that, I'm going to go to the camera, go down to viewport display and increase passport out all the way to 1 so that I don't see anything outside my camera view. Now I can go to the world settings and just reduce this color down to black so that we get the nice screen space reflections due to our emissive objects. I also don't want my light to be present in the scene, so I'm just going to select it and press delete. Now, again, I can select my geometry node object, go to the materials, and this time play around with the strands. So for the strands, I'm going to go ahead and decrease the roughness to something like 0.4 and just increase the metallicness to something fairly high, maybe 0.8, and that gives these nice reflections. But to get the maximum number of reflections, we can select the ones that we selected to be lights, and for those, delete the principal BSDF, search for an emission node, plug that right into the surface, change the color to the blue, and increase the strength to something really large, so maybe 200. Now, once you have this emission actually visible, you might not like the distribution, so you can always go back to the geometry node editor. You can clearly see which one was our strand creator, and this is the lit strands, so we can play around with the seed again, just to get different variations of this and have different one of of these actually lit up. Now I'm going to play around with this a little bit before I hit the render, and that's the variation that will be available on Patreon for all of you to download and play around with. Apart from those few lit strands, I also feel like these spheres are all too regular of a shape. So I'm going to go down to the sphere creator, which is over here. And for the scale, I'm just going to press Shift A and search for a random value node, plug that into the scale. And remember, we're using float itself because we want to scale by the same amount on all of the axes. And that just helped change the size of these spheres. Now, I don't want them to get this small, so I'm going to increase the min value to maybe 0.5, and I'm going to increase the max value to maybe 1.5, and that just helps create some variation in size as well. Now you can go back to the shader editor and play around with the spheres as well to just make them more reflective. We'll reduce the roughness to maybe 0.3 and increase the metallicness to maybe 0.8, and just play around with these till you have something that you feel looks nice. Remember that this is an animation that perfectly loops and has all of these waviness added to it. Once you're happy with the animation and motion and texturing, all you have to do is press render animation, and with that you'll get something that looks like this particular animation. Hopefully you learned something from this video, and if you actually watched to the end, thank you so much. The watch time will really help me to monetize my channel and meet the minimum YouTube monetization criteria, which has been fairly hard for me. But until I do reach the monetization criteria, I'm gonna keep creating videos for all of you every single day, and until the next video comes out, keep creating. Comment your questions down below and stay creative.